For most people, except for farmers, the decade of the 1920s was prosperous. Americans speculated in stocks in very high numbers, often overextending themselves in the hopes of getting rich quick. People bought on margin, putting down as little as 10 cents on the dollar in the hope that the stock would rise fast enough to cover what amounted to very substantial loans. Even though production in well financed factories soared, the buying power of consumers failed to keep pace. Soon industry was making more than people were buying. As goods piled up and prices fell, industry began laying off workers. People without jobs do not buy goods. They do not take out loans to purchase homes or to open up new businesses. As more workers were laid off, the marketplace shrunk smaller and smaller. Despite this cycle, stock prices continued to spiral upward, but the market showed warning signs of instability. During the autumn, stock prices fluctuated widely. Then, on October 24, 1929, the stock market was seized by a selling spree. 5 days later, on October 29th, now known as Black Tuesday, the bottom fell out and stock prices plummeted. With stock prices falling, brokers called their margin loans, demanding immediate payment in full on stocks that were now worthless. Many investors were wiped out in an instant. A rash of suicides swept the business community. In 1930, 1,300 banks failed. By 1933, another 3,700 would fail. When the Depression hit, Hoover had a public relations nightmare on his hands, and things did not improve. In the summer of 1932, thousands of veterans of World War I traveled to Washington to see Hoover. Congress had voted them a bonus for their war service. The bonus was not due to be paid until 1945, but the men needed the money now. Men began traveling to Washington, some with their families, and they became known as the Bonus Army. It was estimated that 20,000 arrived in Washington. Hoover would not see any of them. The police asked them to leave, and they refused. And the police went to Hoover and said, "This is really a sanitation problem. We're going to have spread of diseases. You need to do something." So Hoover sent the army with 6 tanks and cavalry, tear gas, guns, and bayonets. General Douglas MacArthur was put in charge, and he went further than the president wished. Many of the men were injured, and a baby was killed by tear gas. The men had been given 45 minutes to leave, and many had responded with bricks, stones, and clubs. MacArthur was aided by his junior officers Dwight Eisenhower and George S. Patton. By 1932, at least 12 million people were out of work. That was 1 in 4 of all those who normally would have jobs. By 1932, about 1 million people roamed endlessly across the country, hitchhiking or riding boxcars. In 1932, a wagon load of oats did not pay for a pair of shoes. In Illinois, in 1933, a bushel of corn sold for 10 cents. And in case you've forgotten your math, there are 46 pounds in a bushel. In the election of 1932, Hoover was the Republican candidate, and Franklin Roosevelt was the Democratic candidate. Hoover did not have a chance. Roosevelt flew to Chicago to accept the nomination. No candidate had done that before. Roosevelt wanted to prove that he was strong enough for the job. In his speech, he said, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people." New Deal became the name given to his domestic policies. One of the reasons that he wanted to show that he was strong enough was because he had contracted polio some years before this, and the full extent of his disability was kept from the American public. Most people, in fact, the majority of people, did not know that he really was as severely disabled as he was. He would wear braces underneath his pants. He and his sons practiced a walk, and what he would do, he had really strong upper body strength that he worked on. He would put his hand on one of his son's arms, and then doing a swinging motion, the son would step forward and would literally pull Roosevelt with him, and Roosevelt would force his body forward. And they did this so well, and Roosevelt would be smiling and talking and laughing all during this time, that people just got caught up with it and didn't really think too much about it, and they really thought that he was walking. In reality, had that son stepped away, he would have crashed to the floor. He could not stand on his own without help. With all of the thousands of photographs that were taken of Roosevelt during his terms as president, there are only a handful that survive today, actually showing him in his wheelchair. He worked very hard to conceal that from the public and to always appear to be jaunty and in good spirits and very healthy. And reporters who saw him in the wheelchair, they refrained from really reporting that. It was a different era in those days where reporting was concerned. Today, because of the 26th Amendment adopted in 1933, a candidate elected in November becomes president in January. But in 1932, the delay was longer. Roosevelt did not take office until March. On his second day in office, Roosevelt called for a special session of Congress to meet on March 9th and then declared a 4-day-long banking holiday. One unusual thing about Roosevelt's cabinet was the presence of Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor. She was the first female cabinet member in U.S. history. Congress passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which permitted sound banks to reopen under license from the Treasury and provided managers for those that were still in trouble. You had runs on banks, and a lot of banks were failing. I gave you those numbers a few minutes ago. Roosevelt wanted to convince people that the banks were healthy, that they were sound, because until you had people putting their money back in the banks where the banks could then turn around to give out loans for people wanting to purchase homes or start a business, the economy was never going to get really started up again. So he had to convince people of the security of the banks, and that was one of the reasons for this act. During the session from March 9th to June 16th, the so-called 100 days, Congress received and enacted 15 major acts from the President. In March, the Civilian Conservation Corps was created to give work relief to young men aged 18 to 25. Altogether, nearly 3 million young men worked at a variety of jobs in forests, parks, recreational areas, etc. The men who joined came from families who were on relief. The men received room and board for a year and were paid $30 a month, $25 of which went straight to their families. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act, June 16th, created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to guarantee bank deposits of up to $5,000, and that still exists today, though the guarantee is for a lot more than $5,000. Another problem developed for farmers in some areas by 1934, and that was dust storms. The Dust Bowl was devastated by drought. It went from western Arkansas to the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles to New Mexico, Kansas, Colorado, and into Missouri. While popular, Roosevelt will have his critics. Three main ones were Huey Long Jr., Francis Townsend, and Father Charles Coughlin. Long developed the Share Our Wealth plans, guarantee everyone a salary of $5,000, and he guaranteed that by basically saying that the rich would give some of what they had to make it where everyone would have $5,000. Townsend develops an idea that becomes the basis for the Social Security Act, and that act was passed in 1935. A second New Deal was launched in 1935. It included the Social Security Act. Works Progress Administration was established to create public jobs for the unemployed. It concentrated on physical improvements, building streets, highways, bridges, public buildings, and airfields. The Youth Administration gave work to nearly 1 million students. The Federal Theater, Arts, Music, and Writers projects brought music and drama to the smallest communities. FDR will be reelected in 1936. Now, some of the New Deal measures had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and several other cases were coming up before it. Roosevelt wanted to stop them and decided to enlarge the court, or packet as it came to be referred to. He did not plan it right. He suggested that the judges who were 70 should have their power reduced. That angered many of the elder statesmen in Congress. The idea was to add a new justice to the Supreme Court for every member over 70 who would not retire. Maximum membership then would be 15. A lot of people were afraid of dictatorships, and this was Roosevelt's biggest publicity flop. On top of that, the economy slumped again. What will ultimately help the U.S. to emerge from the Great Depression, as the 1930s were referred to, will be the outbreak of World War II and our role in it.